What we've seen actually over the last few decades is a broad openness to refugees in Germany, in part because of the history. So Germany, of course, itself was a major source of refugees and a cause of displacement early on in the 20th century. And for that reason, in its constitution, actually built in a principle of asylum. And that, I think, is also filtered down over the last few years into its policy towards refugees more broadly. The current Chancellor, Angela Merkel, has maintained a relative openness to refugees over the last few years and has made it very clear that this is part of her policy and that she sees Germany taking on this position both within Europe and worldwide. So I think it's part been history and part sort of political leadership by the current government.
COVID, no doubt, has made refugee resettlement a major challenge as countries shut their borders. Has that improved as efforts to combat coronavirus have improved?
So we have seen a few of the border restrictions that were implemented in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic lift, but still more than 50 countries worldwide have shut their borders with no restrictions or no provisions for allowing entry for refugees. And so I think many of the border closures that we've seen implemented during the COVID-19 pandemic are actually here to stay for quite a long time and have actually provided in some cases, some cover for governments who are already looking to implement more restrictive measures on their borders to restrict the movements of refugees.
Before being resettled, thousands of refugees spent time in refugee camps. What has the access been like to things like COVID tests, therapeutics, vaccines in those places, and also outside of those places in less informal settings?
Well, there was a lot of concern in the early days of the pandemic that refugee communities would be among the most heavily hit by COVID-19 because of the conditions in which many refugees live, very crowded conditions. We didn't actually see that that was the case in the early days of the pandemic, in part due to strict lockdowns around refugee camps. But as we've seen more contagious and new variants emerging, refugee communities are being harder hit in many countries. And there's a lot of concern, particularly around the ability of refugees to access vaccines. So far, more than 150 countries have indicated to the UN Refugee Agency that there actually will be including refugees in their vaccination campaigns, but relatively few vaccines have actually reached refugees to date. And in large part, that's due to supply issues. So more than 80% of refugees worldwide actually live in developing countries, and those countries themselves have had limited access to COVID-19 vaccines. There's also likely to be logistical concerns and logistical and practical constraints to getting refugees vaccines as the rollout progresses. But right now, the primary issue has really been about supply.
Canada has a model that the U.S. doesn't, in which communities can sponsor a refugee. Is that the exception, or is that pretty commonplace?
So it's a great question because this is actually something that's really been a bright spot, I think, on the horizon with regard to addressing the situations of refugees. Canada's model is fairly unique, and it was the first country to actually introduce a refugee sponsorship program. But many countries across the world have actually been looking to Canada and looking to adopt different versions of its model. So there are several countries in Europe right now, just to name a few: Ireland, the United Kingdom, Germany, Spain, who have introduced refugee sponsorship programs. Argentina and South America has also introduced a program, and the United States is considering, under the new Biden administration, also creating a sponsorship program. So I think this is one of the few places with regard to addressing the concerns of refugees where we've actually seen some progress and some energy in the last few years.